presentación. Perdón, ya está. Listo, sí. Es un honor para nosotros contar con el profesor Giovan Battista D'Alessio, que nos presentará un trabajo titulado The Problem of the Absent I, Lyric Poetry and Deixis in Mediated Communication. Con este trabajo finalizamos ya las actividades de este ciclo internacional de conferencias online. La dinámica de la sesión será, como en el resto de las sesiones que hemos tenido en este ciclo de conferencias, que primero escucharemos al profesor D'Alessio presentar su trabajo y después tendremos un espacio de preguntas o comentarios que pueden hacer todos los asistentes a esta sesión. Pueden hacer sus preguntas de viva voz, o bien, si alguien así lo prefiere, puede formular su pregunta también aquí en el chat. Yo voy a fungir como moderador de la sesión. Y bueno, pues un saludo también a todos los colegas de Barcelona y de Cataluña que se han conectado ahorita. Y bueno, antes de darle la palabra al profesor D'Alessio, el profesor Baruch Martínez hará una breve presentación del profesor D'Alessio. Adelante, Baruch, te escuchamos.
Buenas tardes a todos. Es un honor para nuestro seminario tener como invitado al profesor Giovan Battista D'Alessio. El profesor D'Alessio no tiene necesidad de presentaciones. Ha sido profesor ordinario de lengua y literatura griega en el Departamento de Estudios Clásicos del King's College London del 2007 al 2014 y es actualmente profesor ordinario de filología clásica en la Università degli Studi di Napoli, Federico II. El profesor D'Alessio se dedica principalmente a la poesía lírica y helenística y a la papirología. Sobre estos argumentos ha publicado un amplio número de artículos y capítulos de libros en las principales revistas internacionales, entre las cuales Bulletin of the Institute of Classical Studies, The Classical Quarterly, Rivista di Filologia e di Istruzione Classica, Studi Italiani di Filologia Classica, Zeitschrift für Papyrologie und Epigraphik, y en sedes como The Cambridge Companion to Greek Lyric, Cambridge 2009, y The Greek Epic Cycle and its Ancient Reception, a Companion, Cambridge 2015, y ha editado diversos papiros de Oxirrinco. Asimismo, es autor de la edición Callimaco Inni Epigrammi Frammenti, Milán Rizzoli, 1996, y está trabajando en una edición comentada de los fragmentos de Píndaro. Sin más, cedo la palabra al profesor Giovan Battista D'Alessio, que, como dijo el profesor Berruecos, nos dará una conferencia intitulada The Problem of the Absent I, Lyric Poetry and Deixis in Mediated Communication. Prego, profesore.
Okay, thank you really very much, and I'm really sorry that I mean, I can understand Spanish, but I cannot speak Spanish. I think it's okay if I speak in English. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Or if you prefer, I could speak also in Italian, but I think that English is probably the solution you prefer. Do I understand correctly? Yeah, is English okay? Okay, okay. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers and to the people attending this seminar, and also to the friends from Catalonia who are listening this this talk. I just want to be sure that you can hear me. If there's any problem, do let me know. And I have circulated, I've sent a handout to Bernardo a few days ago. And that is the important thing, because there's going to be also a PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint is very much a duplication of the handout. So if you have the handout, you can follow very well with the handout, but we also are going to have a PowerPoint. Now, this talk is about an important aspect of the pragmatics of lyric poetry. That is, it is about. Yeah, I can see that we have the handout in the chat. We can let's. Yeah, we can share the PowerPoint. Just a moment. Let's see if it. Yeah, and let's start with the Okay, yeah. So we have the PowerPoint here. That's about a problem in the use of deixis and the pragmatics of Greek lyric poetry and of lyric poetry more generally. So my talk is articulated basically in the following sections. In the first part, I'm going to give a very short introduction to the linguistic problems which are involved in the issue. That is, what is the nature of indexicals and of first-person forms in communication. The second part is going to focus on the way in which these linguistic features are treated in genres different from lyric poetry. So I'm going to focus on some forms of communication that developed in the late 6th, starting from the late 6th and the early 5th century, that is the drama on the one hand, and epistolary communication on the other hand. After which I'm going to focus on the use of the first person in lyric poetry with an important excursus on Hesiod, focusing on a particular issue, that is the problem of the let's say the divorce, the separation from the first person, which is expressed within the text, and the performance. I mean, we are going to deal with performance texts, and the issue is how are we going to assess the cases where the text and the performance are showing a gap, I mean, in the way in which they make use of indexicals. And my very last part is going to be comparative. That is, I'm going to show how several features of ancient Greek lyric can find parallels in other kinds of performance poetry in different cultures and periods. And eventually I'm trying to draw a balance. I'm trying to see what we can say about the use of these features in particular. This is going to be the articulation of my talk. So first of all, we have a problem with the first person, which is not a problem of literary communication. It's a problem of communication in general. I mean, the first person belongs to a category, a linguistic category which is defined by linguists as indexicals. What does this mean? These are parts of the language which have no... Sorry. Sorry. I think there's noises. Somebody has to mute themselves. Is it okay now? Yeah. Okay. So indexicals are means parts of the language that have no semantic content of their own. That means that you can make sense of indexicals only in reference to the content of the utterance. That is, so it's something which we make constantly use in everyday face-to-face conversation, and which we are trained to make sense of. I mean, we every time we talk to each other, we make use of these indexicals, but these indexicals have no semantic content of their own, but they depend on the context of the utterance. And among these indexicals, the first person is one of the most pervasive. We make use of them almost constantly. It is an object of debate among linguists whether this sort of first-person indexicals are a universal feature of all languages, or whether it's simply a way in which we can make reference to this subject of the utterance. In fact, as we are going to see, there are also alternative ways. For example, somebody can refer to himself or herself not only through indexicals, but also through different devices. For example, you can speak of yourself in the third person or using your own name. This is something which can be done, and it is part of the ways in which you can refer to the subject of an utterance. But I mean, it is a matter of fact, first person indexicals, if they are not a language universal, they are a very important feature of communication. Now, so it's in ordinary language of conversation, there is no context-free meaning for any markers of first or second person reference. That is, I and you have no meaning of their own. They only, you can make sense of them only based on the context of the utterance. And we can make sense of them through an inferential process. It's not something which you have to decode based on the meaning, but you have to infer, to make an inference about the function of these indexicals, of these markers. So this is a problem which we very often, without being aware of this, which we face constantly, every day in our conversation. Now, one of the problems which is going to interest us in this talk is how do these markers behave in what we can call performed literature or performed poetry. That is a context which is, on the one hand, based on a context of utterance, on the other hand, is conveyed through texts that are in a problematic relationship with the context of the utterance. So my main focus is going to be on lyric poetry, but before focusing on lyric poetry, it is going to be useful to have a look at what was happening in other literary genres, more or less around the same time we are going to explore now. First of all, we can have a look at the drama. Drama in Greece arises more or less around the end of the 6th century and develops through most of the 5th century and then later on. And of course, it belongs to a particular linguistic category. Because, I mean, dramas were meant for an audience. I mean, they were addressing an audience, but their pragmatic coding does not reflect the communication with the audience. When I'm using the indexicals in a drama, I'm not using them as if I were addressing the audience, but I'm using them in order to evoke a space and a time, a context, which is different from that of the audience. It's not shared with the audience. And this happens through different devices. One device, of course, is that this takes place in a particular place, in a ritualized context. Then you have all sorts of props in order to make clear that this is not part of a normal everyday conversation. People are wearing costumes, masks, there are props and so on. So there are extra linguistic markers that help the audience in understanding that the reference is not that of a shared context. But of course, indexicals too are extremely important in order to mark this shift. And it may be useful to have a look at the opening of what is arguably the first entirely preserved drama of the Greek world, of the whole Western world. That is Aeschylus' Persians. You find them both in the handout and in the PowerPoint presentation. It opens with a chorus entering the stage, first chanting, then singing. We have a series of anapaests at the beginning, and these are the very first words of the drama. Tademen person ton oikomenon elad esaian pista kaleitai. Now, translating these words is not as easy as it may look at the first time, at first sight. If we have a look at the Loeb translation of these lines by Alan Sommerstein, it reads, "Of the Persians who have departed for the land of Greece, we are called the trusted." Now, from a semantic point of view, this translation is of course correct, but we can see immediately that Sommerstein has made a shift. I mean, the chorus are talking about themselves using the third person, not the first person. So this is an example of these alternative devices which we saw earlier on. It is called, from a linguistic point of view, illeism, from ille, the Latin pronoun, so talking about oneself in the third person. So this is what they are doing. But then it is interesting that this third person is reinforced through a deictic, tade, which we find at the beginning, tade pista kaleidai. That is the proximal deictic. Now, we find something strange going on here. That is, this deictic, of course, from a linguistic point of view, helps moving the audience from their everyday context to another context. It's explaining the audience that they are have to move their cognitive space from one situation to another. So tade doesn't really work for the audience. It tells the audience that what they're seeing is not what they're seeing. It's a way to help the audience reinterpret what they are seeing. On the other hand, so tade theoretically should make sense not for the audience, but for the fictional context evoked in the text. On the other hand, of course, it would not make sense within that fictional context to present themselves in this way. So what the chorus is doing is something strange. I mean, they are creating a bridge through language between the audience and the fictional situation, with a sentence which, of course, doesn't really make sense in either context. It's not a sentence which you would use if you were a group of Persian people, and it would not make sense for the audience. It doesn't really make sense for neither, but it works in order to create a bridge from one situation to another. So this is one of the ways in which deixis can really exploit the potentiality of everyday language in order to create different realities. But this is not everything. There's also something else going on, because the first two lines of the Persians also have a different referential value. They also point not simply to a bridge between two cognitive context, but also to another text, so to a cognitive context created by previous drama. That is the beginning of definition women of Phrynicus. That is a text which had been performed a few years before the Persians within the same context. It's about the same war. It is a different episode of the same war, but as you can see, it is quite clearly almost a quotation of that line, tad esti person ton palai vebe coton. In this case, tad esti is not a case of a first-person reference. It's not a case of Illeism, but it is a character on stage who is describing the place where he is acting, that is the council of the Persians. So this bridge between audience and fiction works also as a bridge between a particular drama and another drama. So we can see the potentiality of indexicals in creating a bridge between different mental worlds. Now, what we can see is that literature and make use of devices which are grounded in face-to-face conversation in order to create new effects. I mean, and this is what we see happening in the drama. Very much the same things happens around the same time in epistolary deixis, that is in what we can call letters. We find letters spread around the Greek world more or less around the same time when we have the evolution of drama, that is second half of the 6th century and then later on forever. Now, the very first letters have been found in lead sheets or tablets from the Black Sea. And of course, before having a look at them, yes, we can see here the very first one of the very first ones from the Black Sea region. It's a text from the second half of the 6th century. Now, there's an obvious difference between a letter and the drama, of course. A drama is meant for an oral performance. A letter is a written text, but there is something in common. I mean, they are making a strange use of a linguistic device which was meant for face-to-face communication. So what happens in letters is that they, by definition, imply a mediated, that is a written communication, but they make frequent use of pragmatic linguistic devices that are grounded in face-to-face communication. And of course, the first person and other indexicals play a very important role from this point of view. Let's have a look at this text. It is a lead sheet which is written both on the outside and on the inside. And the outside gives you the coordinate which help you to make sense of the inside. That is a description of what's going on. This is, I mean, let's have a look at the translation. Achillodoros is a piece of lead to his son, and Anaxagoras. So we have the indication of the sender and the recipient of the letter, and this I mean, gives you the coordinate for making sense of what happens after that. But then if we have a look at the content inside, we can see that the sender presents himself constantly in the third person. You can see Protagoras is the name of the son, he is addressed as if you were in a piece of face-to-face communication. No? The father is addressing the son, so it's Protagoras. But then he is talking about himself using the third person. Your father sends instructions to you. So we have another case of referring to oneself in the third person, and this goes on throughout the whole letter. So the father always speaks about himself in the third person. On the other hand, the tense using in the letter is the present of the moment when the letter was written down, was composed. So we find that the letter is mixing up the levels of the indexicals. So on the one hand, we have a focus on the here and now of the sender of the communication, but then the sender refers to himself in the third person, not in the first person. But we know that very much in around the same time, there were other options which were available. So we can see a slightly later letter from the Black Sea region, which has more or less the same structure, and it starts with the outside. Apatorios is the nominative, is the sender, and leanacti is the dative, is the recipient. And then in the inside, we also have lenacti apatorios. But then on this particular occasion, in this case, the sender refers to himself in the first person, not in the third person. So we have a different option. Both options were obviously available. Mediated communication opens up various possibilities. And one of them is making use of the third person. One of them is making use of the first person. But then what we find in many other letters is that we can have also shift. A letter which starts in the third person and then shifts in the first person. This is something which we find fairly often, for example, in letters reported by Herodotus. Herodotus has several letters, and several of them have this shift from an early section in the third person, moving toward the first person later on. So we can see the various ways in which mediated communication exploit linguistic devices that were and that are, meant in the first place for a different kind of communication, that is that of face-to-face communication. I mean, these linguistic devices, the indexicals, as we saw at the very beginning of this talk, need to be interpreted based on their utterance context. So one of my questions is, when we have a mediated communication, when the utterance context is in some way separated from the text itself, then these linguistic devices can be used in various more complex ways. Now, of course, Greek tragedy and the first letters belong to different kinds of communication, and in their turn, both of them are different from the case of Greek lyric poetry, in which we are going to focus from now on, after stopping for a moment on Hesiod. Now, what is the main difference between Greek tragedy, Greek letters, and Greek lyric? Now the main point is that differently from Greek drama and Greek letters, Greek lyric is a genre which foregrounds its performance context. I mean, it's a genre in which stages a communicative situation in which there's a first person who is sharing the deictic field with his or her audience. So this is something different from drama. And the communication, I mean, the performance, which is staged and envisaged in the text, takes place here and now, apparently. But then there are several problems if we start from this assumption. One of these problems is that this scenario, the scenario which I've simplified now in my previous sentence, presupposes that lyric poetry is really the transcription of a face-to-face performance, which is actually not really the case, because we know that we have texts and scripts that were meant to be disseminated in various ways, even beyond their original performance. Now, it's not important for us to decide whether they may have been meant for being reperformed in several ways on several occasions, or whether they may have even been written down and circulated in a written form. I mean, this is not really relevant for my purpose. What is relevant is that the textual form can be described as being entextualized. This is something which you'll find if you have a look at the bibliography in the title by Bauman and Briggs, 1990, which explains the term entextualization, that is the process of rendering discourse extractable, of making a stretch of linguistic production into a unit, a text that can be lifted out of its interactional setting. That is, Greek lyric presents itself as being part of an interactional setting, but then the texts that we have been extracted out of that interactional setting. So a text is entextualized when it can be extracted from that interactional setting and becoming a text. It's not important for us whether this implies writing down or reperformances. The entextualization means extracting something from its context and making it a text on its own. Now, this is really the case of Greek lyric poetry, because this is I mean, the reason why we can read lyric poetry now. I mean, if it had not been entextualized, we wouldn't have been able to read lyric poetry. So it is quite clear that we are dealing with entextualized linguistic interactions. Now, Greek lyric is particularly interesting, therefore, for its use of deictic devices and for the paradox it entails. I mean, in foregrounding its link to a performance, and at the same time, its entextualized status. So one of the interesting points about Greek lyric is that of this paradox. On the other hand, I mean, some of the features which are so important for Greek lyric can be found also in texts belonging to different genres. And I want to dwell very quickly on a very interesting and complex text that is often overlooked when discussing this sorts of problems. That is the section of Hesiod's Theogony, where we have the famous first appearance of the poet in his name and as a first person in Greek literature. This is a very well-known passage, but its linguistic implications are often overlooked. Let's have a very quick look at this text, reading the translation from the Loeb edition. One time they, that is the Muses, thought Hesiod beautiful song, while he was pasturing lambs under holy Helicon. And this speech the goddesses spoke first of all to me, the Olympian Muses, the daughters of Aegis holding Zeus. And then we have the speech of the Muses, field-dwelling shepherds and so on. We are not dealing on this very problematic and fantastic lines. Now, what we find here is something very interesting. If we have a look at line 22, we see that Hesiod is mentioned in third person, making use of his name, Hesiod. Then, once we move to line 24, we have the appearance of a first-person pronoun, me. Now, it has been an object of debate about scholars whether this me goes with tonde or whether tonde goes with Newton later on. That is, the Muses addressed their speech to me who are here, tonde me, in which case, arguably, we should redivide this in order to have the emphatic form of the pronoun, tonde de me. If you have emphasis, we need the emphatic form, or whether we have tonde Newton, apon, with me by itself. So this is one problem. But the second problem, which has also vexed scholars, is whether we have a shift from the third person to the first person here, or whether we are dealing with two different individuals, whether Hesiod is a person and me is another one. Now, from a semantic point of view, we have no way to choose between these various options. This is a case where basically there were two elements which would have contributed to the interpretation. One of them would have been contextual, that is, people who had expectations about the identity of the first person, and the other would have been performative. That is, you could stress the link between tonde and me or not. Now, from the point of view of a written text, as it has been shown by different scholars who have been dealing with this, basically we have no way to choose on purely semantic grounds. And this is in case we accept, as most readers do, the shift between Hesiod, third person, and me, first person, we have an early case of the same shift we saw in the letters later on. I mean, third person to first person, which is something which we find, as we are going to see in several other contexts. It is rather curious that very recently some scholars have argued that these lines 24 and so on should be deleted, exactly because there is a shift between the third person and the first person, which I don't think makes a good ground for this. Now, this is a good example of the complexity of the interpretation of indexicals in third-person poetry. That is, in many cases, it is impossible to decide on semantic grounds. And of course, it is quite possible that several readers or several audiences may have understood these lines in different ways. I mean, there is no single way which is the right one. So I mean, based on the text itself, it doesn't really mean that all of them are right, but all of them are possible from a linguistic point of view. And of course, this has to do with the fact that we are not dealing with face-to-face communication. I mean, if we were listening to an utterance which was uttered once for all, I mean, if we were there, we would be able to make sense of it. But the point is that we are dealing with untextualized texts which raise all sorts of problems. And this is the sort of problems we are going to face now, that is the Pindaric ones we are going to explore very, very quickly, because there is not really much time for this. Now, when we move to lyric poetry proper, and to Pindar, who is the best known example of lyric poetry, because he is the author, I mean, whose works have been better preserved in the medieval time. Now, in recent time, I mean, I'm talking about the past 50 years or so, there has been a very important critical focus on the issue of the link between these poems and the performance context. This is something which was very important and useful in order to move away from biographical interpretation, which were fashionable in the first half of the 20th century, and which helped to make sense of the literary features, but also of the background of these poems as part of a social communication, as the central focus of scholarship in the late 20th century. And from this point of view, it was particularly influential, the work done in Italy by Bruno Gentili and his school in Urbino from the 60s onwards, but not only, of course. Now, and this is something which we can take for granted nowadays. I mean, the important focus on performance context for Greek lyric poetry. But then there are some problems which are going to arise from a linguistic point of view if we focus mainly on the performance context of this text. That is, there are several cases where the indexicals of the text are not meant to work only as if they were meant to be a reproduction of a performance context. Let's have a couple of examples. One of them is that there are several cases in which the first person in Pindar cannot be identified with that of the performers, but has to be identified with that of the author of this text. And in some cases, it is quite clear that the first person who is uttering the words of the poem cannot be present at what is presented as the performance of the poems themselves. Of course, the poems were performed. They were, the performance was really the focal point of these poems. The poems talk about the performance. They were meant to be part of a performative communication, performative context. On the other hand, there is a shift in the way in which its language works. That is a sort of a paradox, let's say, a paradox in which the first person is divorced from the performance context. this is exactly the sort of paradox to which we should be ready by now, after having seen how it works in drama, in letters, in Hesiod, for example. But then let's have a quick look just at a couple of examples. We have a quotation from the beginning of Pindar's Isthmian 1. And in this case, you have the translation in the handout, but not in the PowerPoint. I'm going to give you a summary of this. The first person is addressing Tiba, that is the nymph, the eponym nymph of the city of Thebes. That is the city to which both Pindar, the author, and the addressee belong. I mean, this is an ode which was written for a victor from Thebes. So So Pindar from Thebes is addressing a victor from Thebes, who is called Herodotus. And of course, we can assume that the ode was performed by a team of Thebans. So everybody's from Thebes here. So there's no problem in addressing Thebes. So far, so good. But then we see that the person who is speaking is also expressing his fear that the island of Delos may be angry at him. Why? Because he is trying to complete two tasks at the same time. That is a paean for the people of the island of Chaos to be performed in Delos, and an ode celebrating the victor who is from Thebes. Now, if we try to identify from a semantic point of view the individual that may fit the bill for this sentence, of course, the only individual is the author of this text, because we have to find an individual who is composing at the same time a paean for the people from Chaos to be performed at Delos, and a poem for Herodotus of Thebes. And of course, this person cannot be the chorus in Thebes. It has to be a different person. Now, if we have a look at this other passage, it's the beginning of Isthmian 8. That is an ode which was composed for an athlete from the island of Aegina. So in this case, we have an author from Thebes, and then we have an athlete from Aegina. And it starts with an address to a group of young people on Aoi, and they are invited to celebrate Kleandros, the athlete. And this takes place in the island of Aegina. And then we have the first person here, to kaiego, and I too here. And I have been asked, Theomai, to invoke the muse, even if I am grieved, aknumenos, in my earth. Who is this kaiego? Is he one of the performers, or is he somebody else? If we go on in the text, we find a series of sentences of gnomic considerations, which I'm not going to translate because this would take too much time. And then these culminate in this sentence here, that is, it is important, it is necessary, that somebody who grew up in Thebes should praise Aegina. Now, that is an individual from Thebes should praise Aegina. Now, in this case, this individual from Thebes is described in the third person, not in the first person. But of course, everything in this text makes sense only if we link this with the previous ego. We have another case of this shift between the first person and the third person, which we find in several other texts. So once again, the person who is speaking here is not part of the group of young people who are celebrating their mate Cleandros, but is a different individual. So far, I mean, we have a sort of a divorce between performers and authors, but everybody could theoretically share the same deictic field. I mean, theoretically, we could think, well, the author was part of the celebration of the performance. But then in Pindar, we have a few cases in which the person, the first person, stresses his own absence. We have cases in which the first person is highlighting, emphasizing the fact that he is not sharing the same deictic field with the addressee. We are going to have a very quick look just at two of these texts, which are very interesting. I mean, theoretically, we should read the whole odes in order to make sense of them, but I'm going to be very concise in describing them. The first is Isthmian II. Isthmian II was composed for a patron from Akragas, Agrigento in Sicily, celebrating the victory of his deceased father. So he was a member of the aristocratic elite and also for a while even a ruler of Akragas. In this ode, which is very interesting and problematic from several points of view, we have the speaker, the first person, addressing this patron who is called Thrasybulus. Now, if you have a look at the first part of the ode is not very long, it's about 50 lines. In the first part of the ode, the first person has generic statements which are, would fit any praiser, anyone who praises Thrasybulus could feel the slot of the first person in these lines. And and he is addressing Thrasybulus as if they were sharing the same deictic field. And this works very well until we reach, so let's have a look at the translation here. Node unknown is the Isthmian chariot victory that I sing, and then may I make a long throw with the discus and cast the javelin as far as Xenocrates, is the name of the father of Thrasybulus, surpassed all men with his sweet disposition. But then, at the very end of the ode, something changes. Because the first person talking about Thrasybulus, the son of Xenocrates, says, "Let the son never keep silent his father's excellence, nor these hymns." So there's a reference to the hymns through a deictic. "For I truly did not fashion them to remain stationary." So the hymns have to move. "Impart these words to him, Nicathipos, when you visit my honorable host." Now, if we read or listen to these very last lines, we understand that we have to refocus our whole interpretation of what has been going on so far. I mean, the first person and Thrasybulus are not sharing the same deictic space, but there is an individual who is going to be an intermediary between them, Nicathipos. And Nicathipos is going to transmit the ode to Thrasybulus. Now, this may seem a sort of detail, not really crucial to the interpretation of the ode, but it is really important. We do not have time to go through this ode in detail, but it is important that the whole theme of this ode is based on an opposition between ancient times and modern times. In the ancient times, praise song was a spontaneous outpour, while now praise song is something which belongs to a professional relationship. So what Pindar is doing here is stressing the distance, the fact that this sort of poems are the result of a mediated communication. Now, the same happens in a much longer and very interesting ode, which is Pythian III. Pythian III was composed for another Sicilian patron, in this case, the king of Syracuse, Hieron. And the whole ode is based on an opposition between what is close and what is far away. That is, it starts with a wish. The first person says, well, I wish that Hieron, the centaur, were still alive, because in this case, I would have persuaded him to come with me to Hieron in order to heal him, because Hieron is ill. We know that he was going, to die from this disease in a few years, but he was already ill. And the whole ode is based on this opposition between what is close at hand and what is too far away to be reached. And the ode stresses the fact that the speaker is not able to go to Hieron in order to bring him a song and health. And the result is that instead of doing that, he's going to utter prayers, he says here, before my door at night. So he stays at home and he utters prayers there. So these are two cases, and that we could find even other ones, which very clearly stage the distance between the first person and the performance situation. Now, in these cases, the interpretation would require much more time than we have at our disposal, but it's interesting that in recent times, a few scholars have argued that this is not really possible. So it is not really possible to have performance poems that in some way divorce the textual reference, the pragmatic reference of the first person and that of the performance. So several attempts have been done in order to make sense of these poems in a different way, reading them in a way different from the one I have explained to you. Now, we do not have time to go into that, but the point is that there are a few reasons behind these scholarly options. And one of them is the assumption is that if we are dealing with performance poetry, we should not adopt something which is based on a readerly approach. We should not read these poems as if they were meant to be read. We should simply listen to them as if they were performance poems. And performance poems imply an identification between the use of indexicals with that of the performance situation. This has been stated by several scholars in recent years. And I think this is wrong for a couple of reasons. The first and main reason is that they produce an interpretation, a reading of these poems, which is less convincing than the other one. Of course, as I told you, when we are dealing with indexicals, there's a problem. Semantic issues are not able to settle the problem. We thought that with Hesiod. So theoretically, with every single of these poems, we could reach the conclusion that one interpretation is more appealing than another one, but we would never be able to say this is the only possible one, because this is the nature of indexicals. Indexicals are of such a nature that semantic considerations cannot be used in order to decide among possible options. But there is another more important aspect, is that if we have a look from a comparative point of view at other performance, other cases of performance poetry from different cultural contexts, we can see that this feature, I mean, the feature of separation between the use of first-person indexicals and the performance context is quite widespread in several cultural contexts. Now, we can have a quick look at some of these in the very last part of my, I think I only have 5 minutes, but I'll try to keep it short. I think I started 12 past and I have 5 minutes, so I'll go very quickly through this. My first example comes from Somali poetry from the early 20th century. Somali poetry is an oral poetry. It's extremely complex from a formal point of view. It's so often very long. And it has an important feature. Well, it used to have. I don't know whether it is, I mean, it's still going on. I base my knowledge on books, I must say, but some of these books are based on reports of people who grew up in that context. That is, it was a very effective medium for political discourse, and it worked more or less in the same way as radio broadcast for other civilizations later on in the 20th century. And the important thing is that very often, almost always, these poems were performed by people who were different from the composers. So the composer normally has a political agenda, and he entrusts the poem to a performer. Now, the poem we have here is the poem which belongs to a very famous individual, with Sayyid Muhammad Abdil Hassan, who was also known, that is the way in which you find it described also in Wikipedia, for example, as the Mad Mullah. He was a very cultured and very intelligent author who was fighting against the British troops and Italian troops in Somalia at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And the medium for his political propaganda was very complex oral poetry. He would entrust this poetry to an intermediary, in this case, this Hussein, whom you see in the PowerPoint, and you find very often in his poems addresses to this Hussein with instructions, but then throughout the whole poem, the first person is not Hussein, who is the one who is reciting the poem, but he is, of course, the mullah himself. So there was a divorce between the first person and the performer. We find similar situations, for example, in medieval Ireland. We have here, in medieval Ireland, as in early 20th century Somali poetry, once again, poets did not usually perform their own poems. They belong to different categories. On the one hand, you have a poet, and the other hand, you have the reciter. We have this medieval Irish poem where a poet is complaining that his merit, his poetic merit, has not been rewarded enough by his patron. And you can see that it starts with an address to the reciter. Go, my reciter, recite my words, depart speedily, and so on. And then he has to convey the message, which is a personal message, to the patron. And this is a situation which you can see, it's very similar to the one we found in Pindar Isthmian 2, that is when the intermediary who is addressed and who has to, and once again, both here and in Isthmian 2, there's an issue of reward, of rewarding the poet for this. And there's a whole category of poems featuring the same feature, especially in the zone of medieval Languedoc, the troubadours, where we have very often the case that poets didn't trust their poems to performers. So we had the troubadour, who was often the composer, and we had the juggler, who was the performer. And here too, we very often have the mention within the poems themselves of the performer. So we have various tornadas of the poet Bertrand de Born in addressing various performers who are supposed to convey the message to the addressees. So these are only some of these examples, but now in the, I think I have I simply would like to draw some conclusion out of this. Do I have still a few minutes for this, or okay? So in order to make it more clear, I'll try to read a couple of sentences from this. Now, what is important here is that we have several examples of what we could call mediated communication. That is, all these were performance poems. They were meant to be performed. They were drawing attention to their performance. I mean, the songs of the troubadours were meant to be performed with a musical accompaniment. The songs of the Somali poets were meant to be performed as well. But at the same time, they draw attention to the gap between the text that is being performed and the originator of this text. Now, this is something which pertains to what we could call mediational poetic communication. And this is something which a few years ago, I tried to draw attention to some other features of this mediational communication. That is in a 2004 article, which you'll find in the bibliography, drawing attention to the way in which Pindar makes use of tense of time dexes in order to achieve very much the same effect. But the use of the first person, and of course the emphasis on the separation between the originator of the text and the performer, is part of a frequent transcultural feature. And there's a very good treatment of this in an article by Richard Bauman in 2004, which you'll find in the bibliography, where Bauman draws attention to this, what he calls mediational performances. And he draws attention to the fact that the effect of mediational performance, that is a performance which draws attention to the fact that it is mediated, has three important concepts which are involved in this. I'm summarizing very quickly. One of them is traditionalization. The other one is socialization of knowledge. And the third one, which is the one on which I'm going to focus here, is authorization. That is drawing attention through the separation itself from the originator of the text and the performance to the process of authorization. That is moving the first person outside of the presentness of the performance, while keeping the performance itself at the very center of the linguistic construction, and I would say also of its ideology, can and indeed should be seen as a keystone in the strategy of authorization. It builds on the effectiveness of performance, but validates it, that is the performance, authorizes it through the displacement of the first person. And paradoxically, it is the absence of the author which strongly contributes to this authorization process. That is, and my point is that this is really a feature which becomes one of the central features in lyric discourse in the Western tradition, and not only in the Western tradition. We saw, for example, we can find similar strategies also in Somali poems. So my very last sentence is mediated or mediational communication grounded in performance culture has important consequences in the shaping of the tradition of later lyric poetry from a diachronic and comparative perspective. This absent presence of the speaking voice, and along with it, the structure of the indirect address, which has been seen by some recent theorists, for example, Jonathan Culler, as central to lyric, bring with them the exercise in the mental reconstruction of a pragmatic context that underlies the experience of reading lyric poetry as well as that of listening to its performance. And this is my conclusion. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor D'Alessio, for this wonderful lecture. We can proceed now to the discussions and questions. I suppose that many of you have questions. Pueden hacer, si quieren, sus preguntas en inglés o en italiano o también en español. Y bueno, vamos a ver quién quiere primero participar. Pueden alzar su mano también. Sí, Néstor, adelante.
Well, thank you, Professor D'Alessio, for this this talk. That was very, very interesting. And I had in mind all the time, well, I wanted to know if you have an opinion about the Pian 6 of Pindar and the way this personification of what I think is Aoidimon, Pieridon, Profatan, it's similar to the things that you are saying there with these other poems, because I think that there's the choruses and that this Profatan person that is supposed to be Pindar is.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and actually I did deal with that passage in an article I wrote many years ago, and it was in 1994 or 95, I'm afraid, on the first person in Pindar in the Ballad in Classical Studies, where I argue that the way in which the first person is presented in the Pian cannot be actually distinguished from the way in which the first person is presented. I mean, I'm not saying it is identical, but has several features in common with the first person of the Victory Ode, and that was against the idea advanced by Mary Lefkowitz, according to whom there would have been a very strong difference between the first person in the Celtic Odes on the one hand and the first person in the Victory Odes on the other hand.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
¿Alguien más que quiera hacer una pregunta? Ya hicieron una pregunta aquí en el chat, pero primero sí, creo que Xavier, ¿quieres? Sí, adelante Xavier.
Ciao Giambattista,
Oh,
tutto bene spero.
Sì, spero anche voi.
Da voi.
Sì, bene.
Just one small question about the text. I didn't know, I had no idea about it. Your number 10.
Yes, just a moment, yeah.
Your number 10, that Hassan, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you explain the relationship between these three different things or entities here, that Hussein, my son, and my words, are these? I mean, Hussein is the dedicatee, or is the person to whom is the addressee, the person to whom the poem is addressed?
No, he is the transmitter. He's the reciter.
Oh, he's the transmitter.
Yeah.
Oh.
I've seen, and he's addressed in several of his poems, and he's the one who was spreading his poems in Somalia. That's.
Oh, I see. So, but then the praise, I am certain that you'll join the ranks of the blessed. This is addressed to Hussein?
Yeah,
or
well,
to another?
Some of them are addressed. I mean, in his poems, there are some sections which are addressed only to Hussein.
Yeah.
Other sections who are addressed to a generic you, so they could work for the audience as a whole. And then there are sections who are addressed to particular individuals.
Okay, and my son refers to that Hussein then?
Yeah, he was not actually the son. I mean,
okay.
Take the way of saying, yeah.
Okay, okay, I see. Then this is not. Then is this addressed to someone in particular, or then this is not addressed to anyone in particular?
No. It's a call to battle. It's a call to battle.
I see.
To the whole population.
It's a call to battle. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I didn't understand that. Yeah.
Because he was a political and military leader against the Italians and the British troops, and this is a call to. I mean, he is entrusting Hussein with the task of spreading his message to his followers.
Okay, thank you.
Jaume, por favor.
Un piccolo Ciao Giambattista.
Come va?
Riesci a sentirmi?
Benissimo.
È un piccolissimo dettaglio a proposito della prima lettera.
Sì.
A mio avviso, vocativo e dopo tuo padre dice eccetera eccetera eccetera, probabilmente che quello che l'autore non scrive è agrafo, è amanuense, e quello è chiaramente una cosa di prammatica proprio. Se parla alla terza persona non è per nessuna ragione ideologica né grafica, semplicemente ciao figlio mio, tuo padre dice, tutto quello che viene a continuazione è scritto da un altro sul dettato del genitore. Questa è la spiegazione.
Sì, questo è l'idea fondamentale è che avanzata da vari studiosi è che chi parli sia la lettera, non il sender, però a questo meccanismo, diciamo, per cui c'è il sender che parla nella terza persona, abbiamo invece delle lettere in cui c'è un passaggio dalla terza alla prima, nella stessa lettera. Ne troviamo, io non ho messo questo come esempio, ma ne troviamo. Abbiamo sia lettere tutte in terza persona, lettere tutte in prima persona e lettere in cui c'è il passaggio dalla terza alla prima.
questo serve, se mi sente? No. Riesco a esprimermi, sì. Questo mi serve, ti dà assolutamente la ragione, e la conoscenza pragmatica di una questione extratestuale è quello che risolve alla tutta facilità questo tipo di problemi. Il Tizio non scriveva da persona, ma probabilmente è lo stesso che capita con il famoso testo Esiodeo. A mio avviso le nostre discussioni sarebbero risolte subitamente se si sapesse se Esiodos è un nome di persona che coincide con quello che parla, o bene un nome di repertorio, eccetera, eccetera, di una nota persona che non è necessario che sia fisicamente presente. Questo ovviamente i primi recettori lo sapevano benissimo, sempre per ragioni e non soltanto i primi. I contemporanei sapevano il livello di astrazione nel nome di Esiodo. Nome personale, nome di professionista, nome di un grande professionista, e questa è la distinzione. Allora questo risolveva automaticamente qualcosa che noi non siamo in grado nemmeno di chiarire.
Questo è senz'altro vero, però rispondo in italiano o in inglese? Cosa rispondo? In italiano o in inglese?
Io credo che...
Per me è uguale.
Sì.
A me difficoltà a parlare italiano. Parlare
quello che volevo dire è che in realtà, anche se noi sapessimo che Esiodo è un nome generico, è teoricamente possibile, da un punto di vista sia pragmatico che semantico, intendere Esiodo del verso 22 e me del verso 24 come riferiti a due individui diversi. Diciamo, il punto fondamentale è che in alcuni contesti si poteva interpretarli identificandoli, in altri contesti si poteva interpretarli non identificandoli. Il punto fondamentale è che il testo in quanto tale è aperto a entrambe le interpretazioni. In alcuni contesti soltanto una sarebbe stata giusta, diciamo, non è che sono tutte giuste, ma dal punto di vista semantico il testo cioè, non è che dal punto di vista linguistico c'è un'interpretazione giusta e una sbagliata, è soltanto il contesto, cioè davanti a un pubblico, se io so che c'è un poeta che si chiama Esiodo e dice bene, le muse hanno insegnato ad Esiodo questo canto, è il bel canto, e mi hanno detto questo, allora io inevitabilmente identifico le due cose, però questo lo posso identificare soltanto sulla base delle informazioni extratestuali che ho, diciamo, sulla base del contesto. Questo è uno dei casi in cui, diciamo, il comportamento degli indexicals, diciamo, è aperto perché dipende da elementi che sono estranei, che sono esterni al testo. Però una volta che il testo esiste in quanto tale, il testo che esiste in quanto tale è chiaramente stato letto ed ascoltato da centinaia di generazioni greche e poi di lettori successivi, in un momento in cui diciamo, ci si basava sulle aspettative dei lettori o del pubblico più tardo da questo punto di vista. Ora, che io sappia, nell'antichità l'interpretazione è sempre stata quella di identificare Esiodo nel verso 22 con il me del verso successivo. Diciamo, nell'antichità, che io sappia, non esistono attestazioni che abbiano separato i due. In epoca moderna vari studiosi hanno argomentato a favore di questa separazione, e da un punto di vista linguistico è esattamente, perfettamente possibile. Ad esempio, Dalla ha sostenuto che quello che noi abbiamo è il cosiddetto deutero-esiodo, diciamo, no? Non l'esiodo originale, ma un altro esiodo. Da un punto di vista linguistico questa possibilità è assolutamente aperta, diciamo, non c'è una ragione di carattere linguistico che possa escludere l'una rispetto all'altra.
Okay, one of our students has a question. I will put it in our chat and I will read it.
Sì, io quería decir una cosa, no sé si lo has visto nel chat, he puesto.
Sì, Jesús, si vols podem...
Després, vale, sí, sí. Okay.
In your opinion, did the drama create rarefied communication contexts in order to take the audience to the time of fiction without the use of deictic or even linguistic devices? Is this relevant to its development as genre? Could it be proposed that the Hesiod is the third person of a real, hypothetical, or fictitious poet, composer, in the person of which 2 lines later a rhapsodic composer finally impersonates himself? I think on Nash hypothesis about Hesiod as hero of a tradition of rhapsody. Does that fit with the mediated communication hypothesis?
Yeah, yeah, these are several questions, so I'll try to. Now, the first one, of course, if the drama did make use of extra-textual devices, apart from the linguistic ones, of course, they did make use of extra-textual devices. People who were attending a drama performance knew that they were going to expect something strange. They were in a ritualized space, which later on became the theater, but it must have been a different sort of ritualized space earlier on. There must have been props, costumes, masks. So it is quite clear that the context did create the expectation for something unusual going on. On the other hand, if we have a look at the very first cases of dramas which have been preserved, we can see that language itself was used in order to create the same effect. So, of course, there were also non-linguistic devices, but linguistic devices were very important as well. And deixis was important from that point of view. I mean, it was something which was very effective in order to create a bridge between different mental worlds. So this is the first question. The second one is if Hesiod, I mean, I think it's basically what Jaume was saying earlier on. I mean, we do not have to think about Hesiod as a single individual, but as a role. Of course, this is certainly possible. It is perfectly compatible with the text. But my point is that from a linguistic point of view, this text is open to various interpretations. So it depends on the interpretive frame which we apply to it if we want to follow one or another one. So it's you can read it as the utterance of a single individual. You can read it as a reference to a role. You can read it identifying the third person and the first person, or you can read it keeping them apart. I mean, all these readings are compatible with the linguistic structure of the text. And of course, it's the interpretive context which makes the difference in this case. And in some cases, interpretive context may be very strongly context related. I mean, if you were the audience of the first performance of this poem, of course, probably we would have some extra textual information which would settle the question. But of course, this poem is a poem which was designed to transcend its first performance. So its structure is open to several interpretations, and this is not only because I'm not a fan of semantic ambiguity, but I simply want to stress that some linguistic features are intrinsically ambiguous. I mean, you cannot decide among them on purely linguistic grounds.
Thank you, Professor. Jesus, ahora sí.
Ah, ok, thank you. Ciao Giambattista, es un piacere rivederti. Y bueno, y gracias a los amigos mexicanos por invitarnos, y veo por aquí muchas caras conocidas, pues saludos a todos. Okay, so my question was, I have found very interesting this element of the absence of the I in the performative context, and that this somehow it enhances the authoritativeness of the utterance. And I was wondering, why does it, so in what sense does it make the discourse more authoritative? I was wondering if perhaps in some sense this remoteness of the author from the eye of the author from the performance context would perhaps take it somewhat nearer to the god, or to the muses, or to that sphere that is not exactly that the icat nunc of the performance. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should not really see a single explanation for all these cases. I mean, it is certainly possible that in some cases distance may create the distance from the audience may enhance the status of the absent person. This is certainly a possibility. But another possibility is that in this way you are marking yourself as the authority behind the text. That is, you are stressing your ownership of the text in some way. The fact that you are not simply the one who is uttering it, but you are in some way emphasizing this. So you are staging the performance, but at the same time you are stressing the fact that you are behind the performance. So this is a communicative strategy that I think that for example, the fact that it is used in different contexts in order to negotiate also the professional value of the composer. We find that in Isthmian II, which is as a poem entirely based on this issue. In the medieval Irish poem we saw, which is about rewarding merit, and in several of the troubadour poets, which the distance in some way helps negotiating the position of the author toward the adversary. So this is another possibility. In the case of Petian III, for example, I think the whole issue is about a dialectic between being close and being far away. And the idea is that the two poles in some way interact with each other. So Pindar opts to remain at home, but at the same time he is communicating at a distance throughout his song. So it's a way of enhancing the capacity of the producer of the text. But I'm sure.
Sorry, I was wondering if perhaps there could be somehow a link or a correlation to, for example, to an hymnical poetry where the divinity is invoked to come. He or she is far away, and I was thinking perhaps in Sappho, in the Sapphic poems, the Ostracon poem, this element that the divinity is far away and somehow it should come here. So it has some correlation between this element of the author being outside and the poem, in some sense, making the presence felt, something like an epiphanical presence felt of the faraway author into the performance context.
Yeah,
perhaps it's too far-fetched. I don't know.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that in the background, it may work. I think Pindar insists quite a lot on the distance which can be covered by his poems, on the swiftness of his poems, comparing them to ships and to merchandise and so on. So it's another way of saying, well, I'm able to achieve this effect from afar. and that's something which, of course, is in common with the gods who can act from afar. And that's
perhaps. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Claudio, creo que tú querías decir algo.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor D'Alessio. It's good to see you again. I am a bit scared to ask this question between so many specialists on the topic, but my question is about determining the space of it's about determining the deictic sphere. And I want to go back a little bit to Jaume's comment about Hesiod, because in that text we have a change going from the third person to the first person, and then further ahead with the moi edon skeptron going back to the first person, and in between we have the muses so to determine the deictic sphere, there is a dialogue. There needs to be a dialogue, which is saying, you know, you are Hesiod, you are the poet, but you are also a peasant, a farmer who knows the songs of the muses. So that question is in relation as well to what you said about Pindar, because I remember this book by Anne Pipin Burnett. She talks about the undetermined sphere of the poet, in which there is a transformative praise, she says, that goes from the poet to the dancers, to the gods, to the... So this indetermination has to do with the poem being a collective. So the I of the poem, as it were, it is a collective I. It is not just the how you call it, the poet. So
yeah.
So my question is, how do you determine where is the I, as it were?
Yeah. Now, so this is a difficult question, because I mean, as I stated at the beginning of my talk, the I cannot really be identified. I mean, I is a slot which cannot be identified on semantic grounds. So there's no identification of the I. I is a function of the language. It's a function of the language which works pragmatically in different contexts. You can give different meanings to the I in different contexts. Now, does this mean that the I is unavoidably ambiguous? No, I don't think so. I mean, it can be ambiguous in some cases, either because of necessity, that is because we lack the information, or because of intentionality. Sometimes you can have an ambiguous I. But there are some cases where we can assess, I mean, the probability. So in the case of some Pindaric passages, there are some statements which do not make sense if you attribute them to the chorus. For example, in the case of Isthmian 8 and other ones. Now, this doesn't really mean that the fact that these sentences were uttered by a chorus did not affect their function. Of course, once they are uttered by a chorus, the chorus in some way impersonate in some form the author. So it becomes collaborative in a way, as you wish, but not in the sense that every statement can work in the same way for all the parties involved. I mean, I think that there was a communicative strategy. Then in some cases we are not able to reconstruct it because we lack the information, we lack the elements. In other cases, it can be part of the strategy. I mean, that there may be some ambiguity. There may be cases where Pindar or the poet may not wish to stress the difference between his voice and that of the chorus. So in these cases, of course, there's no point. I mean, the I mean, it can be overcharged with identifying features, or can be left, I mean, almost empty in some cases. So if we look at the case of Instrument 2, for most of the ode, the first person is a first person which is suitable for whoever utters those lines. But then, if we move to the end of the ode, things change. I mean, those sentences are not suitable to everyone. I mean, they make sense only in a particular, under particular circumstances. So we have to, in order to make sense of those circumstances, we have to make, to create our mental context, lacking the external context because we were not there at the first performance. So in the case of Pindar, I would accept the idea that there can be a collaborative I, but I wouldn't really formulate this in the same way as Anne Barnett did. So from this point of view, I wouldn't really agree entirely with her. In the case of Hesiod, of course, we have the third person, that is the use of the name and the third person, and then it moves to the first person. In between, there is a second person as well, because the muses are addressing the poimen and sagraloi, which includes also the speaker, the first person himself. And I think there's no problem at all in understanding all of these referring to the same individual. I mean, you can have a shift from the third person to the first person. There's no problem. We find it fairly frequently. On the other hand, you can also read it differently. I mean, it's a matter of following an interpretive frame. But I'm not really sure whether I answered your question regarding Pindar and Hesiod.
Yes, I guess yes, you did. I guess my question and my point was that the eidetic meaning needs dialogue. It needs the position of another person, as in Hesiod. So when we move in the vocatives to the first person plural, it becomes a little bit more clear that Hesiod speaking of himself in the third person, because he is speaking of himself as a poet and as a peasant. But I guess you answered my question fully, yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
¿Alguien más?
Io voglio dire, è solo una postilla, c'è soltanto una postilla, se mi sente?
Sì,
C'è soltanto una postilla all'intervento di Bernardo. È vero, ma il rapporto probabilmente fra la sua lezione nagiana di Esiodo si può continuare ovviamente con l'inno omerico a Delos, dove adesso ho il testo in vista, ci sono costanti cambiamenti, ci sono chi è quello che vi piace di più? Voi rispondete tutte alla terza persona, un uomo, eccetera, eccetera. E allora c'è un spostamento regolare e costante, probabilmente per la stessa ragione, perché Omero in questo caso c'è Omero e c'è il Deutero-Omero, per dirla come va la briga. Voglio dire, quello che parla, quello che in quel dato momento si mette sulla si mette sull'ombra del grande, del primo. E allora questi slittamenti sono espressi per medio di un sistema di cambiamenti molto veloci dei ticci.
Sì.
Alle volte diventano per noi estranei perché c'è lo spostamento molto veloce. Lo spostamento è il segno linguistico di questo parlare nelle persone di un altro, di un grande predecessore, ma era soltanto una postilla.
No, no, assolutamente, questa è una interpretazione assolutamente fruttuosa, diciamo, di questo testo. Ecco, però rimane il fatto che nel caso del testo di Esiodo, se noi guardiamo invece il modo in cui gli antichi hanno letto questo testo, no? Da quello che noi sappiamo, poi ovviamente ci possono essere letture che non hanno lasciato traccia, ma ecco, tutti quanti loro hanno interpretato Esiodo e me come, diciamo, la stessa persona, diciamo. Dopodiché è possibilissimo pensare che diciamo, ci sia un meccanismo di identificazione o anche un meccanismo di distinzione all'interno dell'identificazione. Io sono un seguace di Esiodo, oppure io sono Esiodo o io sono un Esiodo. Abbiamo vari modi di poter leggere tutto questo. Ecco. Però la cosa interessante è che proprio una caratteristica dell'indexicals è proprio quella di creare queste possibilità interpretative, che sono delle possibilità interpretative che nascono dallo stato che io chiamerei mediazionale di questi testi, cioè sono testi che da una parte sono, come dire, articolati con i meccanismi linguistici che sono tipici della comunicazione face to face, ma dall'altra parte, diciamo, sono, come direbbe Bauman, entextualized, e una volta che sono entextualized questi meccanismi acquistano delle potenzialità diverse, che possono essere in parte volute e in parte invece derivanti dalla tradizione, ma anche quelle che derivano dalla tradizione fanno parte dell'interpretazione dell'opera, cioè il fatto che in antichità Esiodon terza persona e me prima persona venivano identificati è un dato, diciamo, che fa parte del testo, diciamo così, in qualche modo, della storia del testo.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if someone else wants to ask another question. We have
Well,
6 minutes. Xavier?
If it's late, if it's too late, I shut up. Otherwise, if you still have are willing to talk a little more, then I can add something. Yeah. Yes. Do I go ahead then? Go. Okay. In fact, it's on the lines of what you, Giovan Battista, have just said. Is that I was left wondering what function could a picture like Hesiod's ambiguity about who is speaking, or who is the reference behind the verbal persons, first, third, me, Hesiodon. Yeah. The thing is that if we assume that a poem is composed for a given occasion, which is the case for the Epinician, it's the case for drama, we don't know exactly for epic poetry, but it's possible. Then there, in that occasion, the ambiguities should be solved, I guess. Then, which would mean that they arise in the subsequent story of the text, yeah, which in turn would mean that they were not a function of the original poem, yeah, but it's a creation of the, as you proposed, I think, in your last words. In fact, no?
I would make a distinction from case to case. I mean, there are cases in which this ambiguity arises from the fact that the text has been detached from its original performance context. And there are some cases where the text was designed to be able to be detached from its original performance context. And I think that most of the texts we are reading today are texts that were composed with the idea that they would be potentially detachable, that is, as in Bauman's word, entextualized. And I'm pretty sure this is the case of all Pindar's victory odes that were meant to work as part of an entextualized communication. And of course, this is true obviously also for Hesiod's poem. Otherwise, I mean, it would not have survived the performance by Hesiod himself. And on the other hand, there are cases, for example, let's have a look at the Altmann's Louvre Parthenion. I mean, the sort of deictic ambiguities we find in Altmann's Louvre Parthenion, I don't think most of them, not all of them, but most of them are probably not intentional. I mean, some of them would have been clear during the performance context and are impossible to recover now. On the other hand, even Altmann's Parthenion has a way of surviving its performability, and this happens through to metaphors and to deixis and phantasma, which is something which plays an important role in Altmann's Parthenion as well. But the indexicals themselves in the poem, I mean, they would have been mostly clear during the performance, and then they are unrecoverable now.
Okay, I would like to ask a little question, Professor D'Alessio, again about Hesiod. In this shift between the first person to the third person, what did you think about this? I will put it in the chat. This verse, the verse 36, this tine, this second person, which is a little bit.
Yeah. No. This has been a crux for scholars for a very long period, and no, it's not part of my argument. I'm afraid I have no idea of my own about this to add to what has been already formulated on the.
Okay. Okay, so again, I think we can finish our session now. Again, thank you very much, Profesor D'Alessio, for your wonderful talk. Y gracias a todos los demás por su presencia y sus preguntas. Y bueno, pues nos veremos pronto.
Thank you really very much for giving me the possibility to have such an interesting exchange with all of you. And I wish you a good evening to the colleagues from Catalonia, and a good afternoon to the colleagues from Mexico. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.